On behalf of EY, I would like to welcome our audience to the next edition of our on-demand audio series on the impact of the pandemic on financial services. In this edition, we will look at the challenges and opportunities facing financial services institutions and the supervisory landscape. To do this, I have an outstanding group of EY leaders joining me again. My name is Brian May, the Accounts Managing Partner for EY's Financial Services Organization. We have Jamila Abston, a partner in the Americas FSO Advisory Financial Services Consulting practice. Jamila rejoined EY from the US SEC, where she served as an Assistant Regional Director in Atlanta for the Office of Compliance Inspections and Examinations. Alex Latore, a principal in the Financial Services Consulting practice, is also with us. Alex has over 20 years of experience at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, working in monetary policy, capital markets, and financial supervision and regulation. And also, he was a senior supervisor on 2 GSIB institutions. Scott Waterhouse is with us, a managing director in EY's Financial Services practice. Scott chairs EY's America's Regulatory Network and is a member of the broader Global Regulatory Network at EY. Prior to joining, Scott spent over 30 years at the OCC in a number of leadership positions. So obviously, our speakers have extensive regulatory compliance experience and have lots to share. So let's jump right in. Scott, we've covered the CARES Act overview on prior editions of this series, and there has been an unprecedented public policy reaction to the pandemic. Financial services regulators and supervisors have also been quite active. How do their actions fit into the overall picture of support?
Thanks, Brian. It's good to be here today. I would echo that the public policy response has been unprecedented, including the CARES Act legislation you just mentioned, along with other legislation. And that's a big component of the response. But there's also been extraordinary measures by the Fed to provide liquidity and funding to the market. And we'll provide a quick look into these initiatives. But today we want to spend the bulk of our time discussing changes in regulatory policy, supervisory guidance, and examination priorities that continue to evolve as we deal with the pandemic. We want to provide a little perspective on what's going on behind the scenes and provide a few reminders about the need for documentation and support for decision making and what to expect from the supervisory perspective once we get past the pandemic. But first, let's start with a quick overview of the Fed's facilities. Alex, can you kick us off?
Sure, thanks, Scott. So the Fed facilities are designed to arrest this negative feedback loop that we've observed between the pandemic, the real economy, and financial markets. Now, clearly the Fed can't influence the evolution of the virus, but what it can do is try to insulate both markets and the economy from the negative effects of the virus on economic activity. What's notable this time around relative to 2008 is both the scale and scope of intervention in the economy. It is considerably larger than it was in 2008. And similarly, banks are viewed as a key area to provide support to the economy in contrast to 2008. Where they were considered one of the sources or origins of the financial crisis. So what we were observing is really the Fed leveraging and revitalizing facilities that were created back in 2008 and calibrating them to address today's crisis, as well as creating new facilities that intervene more directly in the workings of the economy. We'll discuss next how the regulatory policy is designed to support the measures that the Fed has taken with respect to its actions. I would say that the regulatory policy is really designed to eliminate any perceived or real obstacles to banks and other financial intermediaries in participating in government-supported actions. And we see that some of those initiatives entail relaxation of capital and liquidity so that support from banks can flow more readily into both households and businesses. In addition, I would say that the regulators have taken action to allow banks the bandwidth and the capacity to deal with the crisis by alleviating some of the regulatory burdens associated with existing requirements. Jamila, do you want to comment and share a little bit of perspective from where you sit on how regulatory policy has been used to support crisis management responses?
Absolutely, Alex. And just to add a fine point on the liquidity discussion, guidance from the SEC has been critical for financial institutions, and particularly their recent guidance around interfunding lending for registered investment companies. So this relief allows temporary flexibility for registered funds affected by recent market events to borrow funds from certain affiliates and to enter into other lending arrangements. So this relief, like the others you mentioned, Alex, provides funds with additional tools to manage their portfolios for the benefit of shareholders and investors. Continuing on to regulatory rules, there's good news for the industry on revised implementation timelines and comment periods for regulatory requirements. This enables firms to focus on economic conditions and crisis support as a top priority. Some examples of those revisions include the Volcker Covered Funds Rule, revised control frameworks, and some adoption of risk measurement rules. However, there are some regulatory rules and deadlines that are still pressing forward, particularly the SEC's requirements and implementation of regulation best interest and Form CRS. As of today, the deadline for applicability and effective date of this rule remain June 30th. Finally, there's a little bit of relief on the regulatory reporting front. Nearly all of the regulators have temporarily relaxed requirements and deadlines for select regulatory reports to reduce operational burden during this time. There's also the permittance and expectation even of virtual board meetings and other virtual meetings just to accommodate crisis-related remote working conditions.
Scott, Alex and Jamila gave a nice summary of the regulatory policy actions and some of the changes. What are you hearing on the supervisory perspective?
Yeah, Brian, supervisors have strongly encouraged banks and financial institutions to work with their customers that are impacted by the pandemic and to work with their communities. It's also a chance here for the banking industry to rebuild its reputation. Banks are a cornerstone of the economy. It's important that they contribute to the economic healing that needs to take place now. And a number of the programs that you just covered are designed to do this. Additionally, actions can include deferring payments, waiving fees, and reducing interest rates. Foreclosures have also been deferred. SBA's Paycheck Protection Program is focused on smaller companies in our communities, and banks are encouraged to participate in that. But supervisors are also stressing that these actions must be done in a safe and sound manner. As the pandemic ends, examiners will be reviewing decisions made by bankers throughout the course of the pandemic. As such, it's important that institutions fully document their actions. They should be ready for this. This can be difficult given the current working conditions where we're all working remotely, but everyone should anticipate this level of engagement going forward. One final point here, Brian. Similar to other natural disasters such as hurricanes where banks have made similar promises to customers, it's very important that banks document that the promises made during these times are indeed promises kept. Supervisors and regulators have been very frustrated with banks promising activities or actions and not following through or being able to provide support that they're actually doing this. So it's important to stay in front of that.
So the Federal Reserve recently put out a statement about reprioritizing its supervisory engagement with banks. We haven't seen similar statements from some of the other regulators. What do you make of that?
The Fed has been the most explicit about this by reprioritizing away from on-site work to more formal horizontal surveillance of the system. And like you say, the OCC and other regulators have not issued specific public statements regarding the supervision to the same degree. But I would say the supervisory goals among the agencies remain largely the same. And while the execution might be slightly different now, their goals remain virtually identical. But we all have to acknowledge that the risk in the system is way up, and the regulators need to remain informed of all activities. So from a monitoring perspective, each regulator needs to understand, to the extent they can, the impacts of the pandemic on the financial system and on regulated entities. So the Fed is keenly focused on capital, liquidity, asset quality, and resiliency. Other regulators are equally focused on those. Consequently, the staff at the regulators are gathering huge amounts of information to inform the regulators. Some of this is routine and off-the-shelf reports. Others are special requests. But in all, this puts a heavy burden on bank staff to respond timely and accurately. And it's important to have quality checks on the information you send in. As a reminder, many of the institutions were criticized after the financial crisis for poor and inaccurate reporting. And in fact, many of the MRAs coming out of the crisis came well after the crisis ended, and many focused on reporting. From an examination perspective, supervisors need to understand the risks in the system and identify adverse trends as quickly as possible in order to intercede or otherwise react. Memories are short, and having lived through this myself, as the pandemic recedes, the regulators themselves will be challenged about the quality of their oversight and the effectiveness of their decisions and supervision. So regulators are trying to perform as much of their normal supervision as possible, albeit remotely, and the goal is to still identify institution-specific issues. I will say we have seen some delays and deferrals of examinations, but these are generally ad hoc and specific to the institution's fact and circumstances. As we discuss this next, it is important for institutions to remain engaged with their regulators and think through longer term the implications of any delays. Overall, while the regulatory burden may shift, it is not likely to go down. The burden may also concentrate on a few key areas of the bank, so it's important to understand any of these bottlenecks and address them as quickly as possible.
Sounds like a real large needle that we need to thread here on this, Scott. Jamila, the regulators, other than what we've just talked about, have a full schedule of examinations. The bankers are working on remediating their current challenges and issues. At the same time, they're rolling out transmission programs that will likely be faced with additional scrutiny. Given all that, how should banks approach the competing demands on resources and programs at this time?
Well, Brian, while some of the regulators have deferred response deadlines, as you know, others have not done so, and they are making decisions on an ad hoc case-by-case basis, as Scott just mentioned. So in the near term, MRAs, regulatory findings, and deficiency letters will continue to require ongoing attention. The expectation is that the financial institutions assess the impact of the crisis-related disruptions on their ability to do issue remediation. They should expect regulators to ask for larger volumes of ad hoc information, and they should be prepared to deliver it securely via technology into remote locations during this time. Businesses really need to continuously consider and evaluate how the agencies might look back at these actions and interpret them and how they might impact their remediation efforts as they go forward. So this is something that needs to be done on a regular basis. And if there are issues or concerns, certainly communication with the supervisor is critical here.
Jamila, if I could interject here, I'd like to add a couple quick thoughts. As mentioned earlier, supervisors are continuing to do their jobs, and they will be challenged and questions about their supervision during this time. In fact, there's no real upside for them to curtail their supervision or waive supervisory requirements. With respect to remediation deadlines, we have seen some instances where deadlines have been extended, and these have tended to be an MRA response was due soon, but the firm was unable to complete the work due to the pandemic, and resources were diverted. These deferrals have tended to be case specific. During this time, it's important to remain engaged with your supervisors. Remember, they don't like surprises. They need to know what's going on, and if you're having any particular problems, they need to be informed. We would suggest over-communicating during this time. If you are seeking MRA relief, you will need to justify the request and demonstrate the impact of the pandemic on your remediation. But be careful what you ask for. MRAs will not go away. MRAs don't age well. And as we've seen many times, the momentum lost can be very difficult to regain. So work with your supervisors and try to iron out a supervisory plan and remediation plan that works both today and tomorrow.
So, Alex, there seems to be a lot going on, obviously, in the regulatory and supervisory landscape. So what are some of the key messages our clients should consider now to be prepared for regulatory and supervisory engagement both now and in the future?
Great questions. And I think Jamila and Scott covered many of the key points that we think are important to keep in mind. The first, I think, in the context of now is making sure there is capacity to respond to increased supervisory inquiry. As Scott noted, what we expect is that the composition of requests may change, but we don't anticipate a reduction in the number of inquiries, if only because the regulatory agencies are trying to gauge the scale and scope of the pandemic and its impact on supervised institutions. Part of that will be developing a cadence and making sure that there's an organized process by which regulators will make requests and supervised institutions will respond to them in a way that's timely, accurate, and complete. It's important that firms develop processes to make sure that that can happen in accordance with what regulators need. In the areas where we've talked about remediation, I think it's important to keep in mind that the impact on remediation needs to be clearly understood of COVID-19. Those could be direct or indirect impacts on the firm. And it's important to have that assessment before engaging with supervisors on forbearance with respect to remediation timelines. It's important to weigh the pros and cons of either seeking forbearance in areas where it may not be provided or offered on the part of supervisors, and accepting forbearance in places where it is being offered. It's important to keep in mind that every day that the examiner is engaging with the supervised institution, they are forming judgments that will drive their supervisory assessments and ultimately the rating of the firm. As I'd like to say, when I was in the seat many years ago, when asked if an inquiry that I had made as a supervisor was related to an examination, my response was always, every day is an examination. In other words, every day a supervisor is formulating a judgment about the firm. So it's important to keep in mind those impacts as requests and offers of remediation timeline extensions are made. I think thereafter, it's important to keep in mind that supervisory priorities will change and there will be inflection points in their engagement with the supervised institution. So it's important to engage regularly and often to understand where and how supervisory concerns are changing. I would also add to that, in many respects, the key challenge during this period, as Scott noted, is trying to strike the appropriate balance between supporting your customers and being able to evidence that, as well as making sure that you are abiding by prudent risk management standards and that you're not compromising the safety and soundness of the institution. So as Scott pointed out earlier, documenting those decisions, and particularly the evidence that you will walk examiners through and other stakeholders, be them internal or external to the organization, is going to be important to collate and communicate. Beyond, related to my last point, is developing a coherent narrative around what actions did the firm take to get it closer to the success measures it laid out as it relates to its crisis relief, and how did it embed risk management considerations prudently, not excessively, not in a way that undermined their ability to provide support, but in a way that fostered that support while taking into consideration the safety and soundness of the institution. Having a storyboard is going to be important to develop in the coming months. As a consequence of the pandemic, firms will have developed new capabilities or they will have repurposed existing ones. And it's important for them to distinguish, particularly given the uncertainty and the duration of the pandemic, between those capabilities that they need to continue to invest in a sustainable way and other capabilities maybe they need to keep on the back burner and not be deployed on a regular basis. And finally, most importantly, as Scott pointed out earlier in his remarks, regulators will be coming back and asking about lessons learned. My experience already with some clients is that they're getting this level of inquiry already. So it's important to set up a process where that evaluation can take place and it can be effectively circulated, communicated, and socialized within the institution so that it reflects the firm's position and the firm's view of its lessons learned in the pandemic. I'll turn it back over to you, Brian.
Thanks, Alex. Clearly, all of this is happening at unprecedented speed. So great insights. And on behalf of our audience, I want to thank you, speakers, today for those insights. And for our audience, I encourage you to stay connected to ey.com for future editions of this series and all of our thought leadership at the web address located on the slide in front. And for any questions or feedback, please contact your EY relationship manager or any of our speakers today. Thank you, and as always, be safe.